So we are going to take 30 minutes for a dialogue. And what I propose to do is maybe we could close the circle here so that we are sitting facing. So to have this conversation with each other, we have invited that initially Bic van der Pol, that Judith Schwarzbart, and that again Kenneth Balfoe will start the conversation with Angelica and with James. But really, we would like that this is a conversation from all the people who are in the room. So if we just take a moment to... And is the microphone available so that... So if we just bring that into the center and then we can move around. Okay, so I know it's sometimes a little bit difficult to speak when it's quite a large, crowded room, but I'm hoping that you will not be shy. I think the key thing, the reason we're having this as a process of inquiry is because we're not simply presenting Park Lake and saying, this is a good thing, this is the best thing, this is the only thing. We're presenting it as an example of a domain of practice which has been mapped out by the two previous speakers in a very clear way to show us we're looking at a global phenomenon whereby the way in which the city is inhabited, is owned, is being contested. But I think when Angelica spoke first, she identified this kind of controversy around, for example, Occupy and the question of whether or not these mobilizations were turning into real agency or what was happening. And I'd like to maybe go back to that question to start the conversation and maybe to look at are we seeing something that is really contesting how power is moving in the city, or are we seeing something that is just going to be caught back in? I'm thinking of the way gentrification was mentioned in one of the projects and how the people are preparing for gentrification. Or I'm thinking about the way in which the municipality can co-opt the work of the artists and say, oh, look what we're doing good things. So I wonder if maybe you'd be willing to say a little on this question of the risk of co-option or the risk of being taken in. And then I'll ask that the others will join in the conversation. But at any point, please start signaling your interest to say, comment, question, make an observation.
Thanks, Mick. I think that, of course, the risk of corruption is always there, and we have to keep discussing it. But as I also said, I think these gray zones of cooperation, or of cooperating also with public institutions, as Kerstin also did, I think this is very crucial, because otherwise you can never be, this long you can't be out of the system. And so the question is how to really create these interfaces. And I would like to come back to the very end, to James' talk, because you were talking about methods. Is it ethnographic, or what's the difference to urban planning? And that is something which I'm really interested in. And I don't agree. I agree with many things you said, but I don't agree that it's so similar to ethnographic work. I think it's very important to keep in focus what is specific about the artistic method. And the way also Kerstin was formalizing her videos and the presentation of the videos, I think all this is something that ethnographic work could not do. And the question for me is also, what could this kind of art practices do differing from urban planning? And I think, again, we have to be really careful, because this kind of modernist, totalitarian planning, like this abstract planning, this is not the state of the art anymore in urban planning. So there's a lot of participatory modes, there is a lot of process-orientated, open-end planning, and so if artists want to contribute to that, they have to have different methods than the process-oriented, open-minded urban planners nowadays, because otherwise I don't need artistic work in this realm. And so for me it's this question, what is specific about the artistic approach and this specific kind of formation of content and form is still very, very valid, and I'm very much interested in that.
Before I move along, is there anyone who wants to? Okay, well then maybe.
I would like to maybe follow up on that a little bit. I'm after listening to your talk and the other two talks, I think it's really interesting how the project landed in the community and how involved and engaged the different people were, or became, let's say, during this process. So in that sense, it's a real big success, you could say, because they sort of took up the challenge afterwards to take ownership of the project and to develop, let's say, the things that you sort of initiated somehow, as a set fire somehow. They took that or are taking that challenge, I must say, perhaps, to develop that further and to really own the area where they live and to take responsibility for that. And I'm not saying that in a sort of authoritarian way, no? The other thing that you have developed in the project is, I would say, and we talked about this as well, is aesthetic means, tools. You develop tools to visually communicate your ideas, to create some kind of vehicles, basically, like the models, for example, to unfold, to open up, let's say, thinking and imagination, basically, no? And then I come to maybe also the relationship to power somehow. We can talk about instrumentalization and the flow of money, follow the money. How does that come? How does that come about? That's maybe for another question. But I would like to refer, let's say, to the institutions where the aesthetic tools are being presented. And in the beginning, I think it was you who referred to that discussion of Grant Kestner and Claire Bishop in Art Forum. I think a lot of that discussion was also about what is art and what is not art, no? So what is that? So I would like to pull that again into this discussion somehow, because the success of the project Park Lek in that specific area, and in a way also in the way how we talk about here, we sort of pull it into the institution. And then there's still, I would say, the problem with museums and art institutions, but perhaps I should say museums, which are public institutions that collect artistic works, artistic practices, show that to the public who is not yet involved. I'm thinking of the 19th century paintings, of, for example, Courbet, who showed the worker, the land worker, let's say, to the people, so unfolding, let's say, that part of society that nobody saw. So it's like, it's opening up, let's say, that those images and these narratives. And I think still what we are bumping into, I think with these kind of practices, and this is hard to say in a group of people, because we are sort of all, this is our own parochial, how do you say that? Our own community somehow, no? We all agree, no? But it's like how to bring, let's say, these aesthetic tools, let's say, to the attention of museums, and maybe more to the mode of how to collect these kind of aesthetic discursive means, and how these means can become an object in the eyes of collectors, I think is still something that needs a lot of attention, I would say. Huh? If I have a proposal, I can only talk about examples, no? Maybe I can talk about the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, without saying that that's the most top museum, but I think maybe it is as well in that sense. What they are trying to do is to what they do is that they buy works which are process-based in many cases, and they discuss with the artist how these works could sort of become manifest in a collection, and they have interviews when they buy the work, which can also be a body of work, you know, how this work came about and how it can be shown and how it can be shown in their eyes, and this discussion is also becoming part of collecting as a method somehow. So that's maybe a careful example.
The Art Util show, I don't know if you saw it, but it's also a good example. Useful art of which also took place at the Van Abbe Museum, which showed a lot of practices all around, and I think it's also collected in a website which is still accessible.
So we have a question here at the back.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm not exactly following up on this trend, so I have a kind of more directed question to Kerstin, but hopefully it's a question that might open up some of what we've been talking so far. During all the presentations, I kept thinking why this situation seems a lot like a model of a democratic situation, but actually it isn't. It's an incomplete democratic situation, because we're performing the discussion, but we're not performing the decision making because we don't have a decision make. We actually don't need to agree. We don't need to take a decision here. And that's a very important part of a democratic process. But in Kerstin's project, there were decisions to be made. And I was very curious, and I think we covered a lot of the discussing process, the bringing people into, the reminding people that they are citizens. But I would be curious to learn more about these decision-making moments, the exclusion moments, the moments where something had to be left behind or that a minority had to be convinced. So I was curious about these moments in the project and how they came up.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
It's a, as they normally say, it's a very good question. So, for one thing, the decision making was never, as we were not looking in the project, we were not, maybe I stand up so you can see me. The decision making in Park Lake was never intended to end up with one consensus decision. Because then, and this is political, we would take away the decision making from the politicians who really were the bad guys, who hadn't made their job. So we wanted them to do their job. And in order to make that clear, the decision making in Park Lake was also had sort of, before going to the politician, it was redirected to a group of elders who were, let's say, some of the most engaged people in both areas, who had trust from their neighbors, who had been in organizations, and who had a big network. And they felt that they could take decisions on behalf of the others. And the decision in there, what they were going to decide about was only to add a recommendation or a critique of what had been decided in the group. So that is the basic, because I really think it's important, and it's an important doubt I have, whether it's really democratic when somebody who is a talk person like me can make a lot of people come to a meeting and then something is decided. I still think it's important that we keep our politicians to the fire. So this is why it was important, and especially there where it was very strange political climate. So the decision-making never needed a consensus, and therefore multiple responses could be there all the time. But then back again to Peter. You said several times to me while we were working, don't end up in a too ready solution, because this democratically stops the dialogue. So this is why it was really important to keep it open, because then the responsibility was within the group of the municipality and the city to keep the discussion going. It's their job to find a consensus. But we made lots of decisions about what to make models about, what was necessary, who was an important part to work with, etc.
So I will.
Yeah, well, actually, I would like to follow up a bit, and I think this is an interesting question, and also actually going back to what you said about method, because I wonder if there's something about this unstable identity of the artist, but also of the artwork, or the artistic project in it. You talked about, I think you said it had multiple identities, but it also had vague identities or undefined or no identity. I don't remember exactly how you described it. But even if you give it a kind of title, I think that even to know exactly what it means is still very much for the participants to contribute to the definition of what it means. And the kind of postponed decision and postponed identity, in a way. And I wonder if that is one of the major differences. I think there are definitely similarities with anthropological and ethnographic works. So it would be worth considering. I think there's been a whole lot of thinking about, reflexivity and questioning of your own sort of position and what do you produce and what do you collect and all that. And I think there's lots to learn from anthropology and an ethnographic method. But I think also to, at least at this stage, to keep with the open identity and in a expanded notion than the open artwork, because I think that's again something, that's a different discourse, perhaps a more aesthetic discourse somehow. But an open identity in a project, that means that you can even work on its very, on the very infrastructure. You can redefine the method in each step. And I think that's something that also differs between academic work and artistic work, is that there are really no rules in a way. The only rule is to think about the ethical position you're taking on, I think, and to sort of insist on some level of reflexivity in that. And in a way, I would wish that it was the same in academia, but there is a tendency that we're very sort of concerned about methodology, and for good reasons, I think. So if we stick to an open identity and the freedom to change the rule of the game along the way, even, you also change the period of time. There are many things that changed along the way. Even the definition of what was the task you took on in that project was redefined along the way. Definitely, particularly in the 3 phases. So, to keep thinking about I guess now we're bringing this project into an art context, not in a collection way, but at this stage, definitely in a more discursive way. Even with the interdisciplinarity part still open, I think it will probably always be part of the project, that it's an interdisciplinary project. Makes no sense to think of it only as an art project in a conventional sense. But to think about what is this open identity is something that I would be interested in also to listen what other people in the room would think about that.
I guess I will comment on several points that were taken out on the floor now, and to draw the line all the way to the discussions of the mid-zeros with Bishop and Kester. I think we're at the same spot now. So, and I think it's also maybe it's a question of tradition, theoretical tradition as well, meaning that at that time it was an American theorist willing to incorporate social theory into his artistical. Yeah, I'm coming to it. So we had Grant Kester, who was, as an art theorist, willing to borrow theories from dialogical social theory to implement it within his aesthetics. And on the other side, we had Claire Bishop, who is not willing to do that, but withhold the proper aesthetics like in a classical European theoretical tradition. So, and now we kind of deal with this willingness again to think of Kerstin's practice as interdisciplinary, whereas we have to incorporate thoughts of ethnography or anthropological tools and investigations, but be willing to keep it open. Like, you're lending elements, tools within a free space, which is art. And therefore, you also gain like power to do so. So that would be kind of my, reading of this kind of conflict or non-conflict, if we are willing,
Maybe I could just follow up to say that if anyone uses a hammer, you don't become a carpenter. Just to say that, because for me, as an artist, we are educated in a way it is a multidisciplinary education. We learn something about philosophy and something about metal and carpentry and whatever. So I think it's important in a way to distinguish between the tools and your profession. So that's one aspect. And I think that James' talk, which we are touching upon, is very important in a way for me to, with Angelica's remarks, to distinguish between when we are, when we discuss a practice like Kerstin's, that we can look at similarities, but we can also talk about differences, and that's been touched upon, that, what are the differences between what you're doing with anthropology or ethnology as a tool compared to an ethnologist when they do it as a profession. So that one aspect. The other thing I would like to touch upon is this about, which Angelica talked about in one of her projects, to make the citizens more clever because of the gentrification. And that is when you produce something. This is not descriptive or normative, if I understand that term correctly, but it's more productive. You're producing something, and I think that is a distinction here between ethnography and anthropology and what you have done, that you're actually producing something new in society, and another type of plan, and you are willing to be a subjective that have opinions about things, and pushing things in different ways and deconstructing the way that you do things. So I think, to me at least, that this idea of production or producing other types of knowledges is really important as a way of looking at these type of practices.
Any question, comment, observation?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was interested in the political side of things, because you mentioned that you had a relation with the local politicians. How do you avoid that your project becomes an excuse, for example, for the politicians in order not to do improvements in the city planning? Yes, how do you... have you thought about your own strategy and how it is used politically by the politicians? Have you reflected on that?
Well, I would say that it was used, and they wouldn't have said yes unless they thought that they could gain something from it. But they were not aware that it started until it had gone quite far. So in the phase 2 of Park Lake, it's only me and the city architect who apply for money from the Statens Kunstfond, who gave me the money. And then we worked for a while, and then suddenly the politicians found out this project was here. So the definition of the project is not theirs. The definition of the project is within the sadness of the city architect over how the builders could decide where to build and how to build and when to build, and my need for to start an experimental dialogue. And this defines how we do it. And then when they find out, I had this problem. It was 1.5 years to elections. So the politicians were too engaged. They were everywhere. I mean, they were like, if we had a discussion, they were like, hi, you know. So it was how to create a situation where these people who came to discuss actually did not put on the autopilot of the politicians, but the politicians could participate, but they were not responsible. So it wouldn't be the audience and the politicians, you know, on a meatloaf here. So how to create a situation where we could discuss, they could listen, but they wouldn't have any agency. And then in the third part, suddenly the mayor said, well, we want you to go the third part of Park Lake, they wanted to pay. And how to control that so that it became a bridge between the people and the planners, not a bridge to the politicians. And this was, what I did was I set a condition that they have to have a project secretariat inside of the art project. And that project secretariat would outgrow me, so they would take over the contacts, because this ensured the people a direct link to the planners instead of having to go to the office of the politicians. But basically, if you ever, this is what I mean with having your fingers in the bucket, you are always a part of some strategy somewhere. And it's only how you deal with it. I was just lucky this time.
Oh, I'll come back. Before, because we're getting close to the time where we're going to take a coffee break, so if you have something to say, now would be a good time to signal. Yes? Okay. Oh, brilliant.
Well, I'll be quick because I have some time after the break. Kirsten, I'm glad you brought up money, because I think that one of the shaping factors for projects, all artistic projects, but one of the much more complex shaping factors for projects such as yours is the flows of finance. And actually, Lisbeth, it comes back to your comments about the relationship to the museum. Incidentally, Claire Bishop calls Van Abbe Museum a radical museum. So, I mean, that's an aside. Because artists' relationship to museums and galleries, whether they be commercial or publicly funded, are a lifeline, a financial lifeline that needs to be balanced with social obligations in relationship to these fingers in the pot money, or what did you say? Fingers in the bucket, hands in the bucket. Yeah. Yeah, buckets with cakes in. This is a relationship which, of course, is very practical and financially equivalent to everyday practices in other professions. But somehow the dialogue and the discussion of it within artistic making is, what can we call it, is unobtainable or is undiscursive. So we have a situation in which we can imagine the artist as all types of things, including an ethnographer, including, you know, and there's obviously a tradition of this within art history. But what we can't do is imagine the artist as a proto-business or financed relationship. And Angelica, this comes back very much to your questions about, you know, all the examples you gave us to do with allowing citizens to take advantage of gentrification processes, for instance. Of course, there are a set of kind of morals and ethics around these issues that we don't examine closely enough. What would be really interesting as part of the anatomization of Park Lek would be to do a financial plan of it, to look at where the money came from and how it relates to museum and gallery money, how it relates to arts money, and how it relates to planning money and civic money, and to do a really close examination of that, I think, will be very interesting on an analytical level, but also on a political level, because we have to be realistic about those shapes if we are to enter into this. And I know there are many artists in the room that have absolute experience of this.
So, James, I'm going to come to you last, just so as we, if you don't mind, just to make sure that we get these questions fresh.
Well, I'm talking from quite a different platform, as I'm a practicing architect. And I can't help wondering how will the actual realization of such a plan based on participation look like. I mean, we know towns, cities, and were planned, professionally planned, and we all also know cities which are not planned before planning actually existed. But this programming always has a physical result, and it's of course very important that the inhabitants are feeling ownership to what is going on. But on the other hand, there's an aesthetic dimension which I would like to know how this has been dealt with, as I regard architecture also being kind of an artistic profession.
While we're here, yeah. Well, no. I think we'll gather the questions. Otherwise, we won't get to them.
Just a short comment related to Judy's question about the postponed identity. And I think what I find really intriguing, I'm intrigued about Kerstin's work, is that she's actually trying to deal with the resources within an area, because in planning there's a lot of identity dealt with from the top, that a certain area has got an identity just by the name. It could be dealing with the water issue, flooding areas, and the whole area has become a brand because of they're sort of living with it and that sort of discussion. And I think by dealing with a postponed identity means that you're actually trying to create the identity of finding out what it could be, instead of just naming it identity and then the whole area has to live with that. And then you just move the problem around, because all the different issues that would be in that area has to be moved on to another part of the city, and then you would start over. So instead of just keep moving around with that regeneration plans which are going on, I think it's a very nice thought that we could actually start talking about how to create an identity over time from the issue what is there, instead of just bringing an identity into a place.
Okay. There was one other question here, or comment.
I would like to turn back to the process of the meetings you made in the local meeting place you made, and how you talked about meeting those young guys and gaining their trust and listening to them, but also being able to kind of say, now you are talking shit. And I'm curious about to know about more details about how you moderate this dialogue with these groups of people or these citizens, and how you kind of sharpened and helped directing this gaining of this knowledge production.
Thank you. Before you answer, I'm going to ask James to do.
Okay. I think it's important to note that ethnography is not the same as anthropology, and Kerstin is not an anthropologist. Yeah. Ethnography is a set of techniques, a rhetoric, a set of methods about knowledge production. Have you read the story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Man of the Crowd? This is a brilliant ethnography. And his main character, who is really himself, who's a criminal who wanders the city, is an ethnographer. So lots of people can practice ethnography, and some of the aesthetic devices in ethnography are common to a number of disciplines, photography, video, for example. And there are anthropologists who are brilliant photographers, and there are artists who are awful photographers, and vice versa. So you know, it's not to say we come to our disciplines almost accidentally, right, through biographical accident. But often I find that it is important to say that there are a set of tools and resources that different disciplines can share. And you know, and it's not that the theorist, the artist becomes a social theorist, and or that Kirsten is an anthropologist. But the idea, but I don't think that I think it's dangerous to try to institute a kind of disciplinary policing. You know, I think it's very important to leave things open. And once we get our union card, PhD or whatever it is, you know, then, you know, we're free to just experiment. And we're intellectuals in that true sense of the word, of experimentation. And so I think that I use the ethnography, and my ethnography is informed by a set of theoretical and scholarly considerations which are not Kirsten's, and vice versa. And so to say that her practice has strong ethnographic elements, or that I recognize what I do as well in that, is not to diminish the artistic production or the aesthetic, is to recognize that all good work has an important aesthetic element. So, anyway.
So I will actually give the last word before we go to coffee. So you two questions and a comment. So one question pertained to the role of the architects. Oh, you have it, okay.
To Karsten. For me, of course, architecture is an art form, and as is planning. When it comes from architects and planners who are really in dialogue with people. And I try to demonstrate very clearly by collaborating with Peter and Marie-Catherine that I'm not an architect. I do not want people to do architecture, but I want them to look at their area through the eyes of these different professions. So in the dialogues, there was a non-hierarchical co-presence of all kinds of professions, also architects, but any decision about what kind of architecture is left to professionals, because otherwise we would have mayhem. So I think this is important, at least for me. As I also think that the art, if I was making a picture, I wouldn't ask the crowd to say whether it should look one way or the other. Then for the question, well, it wasn't a question. We had the great luxury of having you, Gitte, up to visit us in one of these discussions. So you have felt on first hand how it was one of these dialogues. And I think they're very similar to what you are doing in Ballerup and in many other ways in India and so on. So it is a method that you yourself is a brilliant example of. And then for the dialogue with the boys, as you understood from the film, you just don't walk in there and try to be wise guy. You need a succession of tests if you are somebody to believe in. And I had the good fortune of having 2 or 3 occasions where there was this one guy standing, just like Nadia standing now, looking like, what the hell are you talking about? And then after the 3rd time, he came up to me and he gave me the hand and he said, "Hello, I'm Ake." And Ake was one of the guys with respect in the area, one of these agents that was a treasure for any planner to know about. And he decided that I was a good one, so I was allowed to sit by the table. And if the guys were stupid, he told them off. And the first time it was, they were passing me, we were sitting like this, and then he said something in his language, and then they stopped and said, "Hello." So this is how it happened. It wasn't because of me, it wasn't because of art, it was because I collaborated with one of the people there. And in the end, he became my pathfinder. So he's the one who tell me, shut up now, or speak now, or call the parents, or, you know. So I learned from him.
Okay, so we're a little bit over time, but we can get back on the schedule if we take a slightly shorter coffee break. So